four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four of them, tell us this story, not to humiliate Peter, but for our benefit. And then thirdly, I invite you to find yourself in the story. Imagine where you would be. Where would you be seated in the Sanhedrin? Or would you see yourselves in the courtyard? So first off, who are these Sanhedrin? Well, they are a large gathering of religious leaders who acted as judges, somewhat like city council. Every Jewish city in the first century had a Sanhedrin, and it's usually made up of about 23 people. In Jerusalem was the Great Sanhedrin. It functioned somewhat like the Senate, and in some ways like the Supreme Court. So they made religious laws, and then they made rulings on those laws. And this Sanhedrin, the Great Sanhedrin, had 70 members plus the high priest. So there were 71 of them. The origins of the Sanhedrin goes back to the book of Numbers, when Moses was struggling to find how to rule, trying to rule over all of the Hebrew people. And God said, appoint 70 judges to rule alongside of you. And so the Great Sanhedrin would have seen themselves as a continuation of this practice. They usually gathered during the daytime. It was most peculiar that they would be meeting in the middle of the night. And some suggest this was totally illegal, what they were doing. But somehow, the word got out to all 70 of these people of the Sanhedrin that they were going to meet at the home of Caiaphas that night. And they arrived even before Jesus arrived. The Sanhedrin was made up of Pharisees, rabbis, and biblical scholars, those people steeped in the law. Can you imagine if the Supreme Court was called together at midnight to try someone guilty of a capital offense? If you found out about it later, you would wonder what kind of justice was being administered. So the crowds that were following Jesus wouldn't have known what was taking place because it was happening in the middle of the night. The temple guard came to the Garden of Gethsemane and led by Judas to get Jesus. And the journey from the garden to the high priest's house was about a 30-minute walk. And it was a kangaroo court. You know, kangaroo meaning that justice served takes leaps forward. And like a kangaroo, leaps forward, and the verdict had already been decided before the first witness had ever been called. It was a sham court. They had already determined that Jesus had to die. Now they just had to find a great excuse to put him to death. Mark's gospel in the 14th chapter, verses 55 through 56 says, the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death. But they found none, for many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. In the book of Deuteronomy, you need to have two witnesses whose testimony needs to agree to put someone to death. They didn't have this. In the end, Jesus is asked a question by the high priest. The high priest acts not only as the head of the court, but he also acts like the prosecuting attorney. So he has a real vested interest in finding this person guilty. He intended to see Jesus put to death. So he asks him this question, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus' answer leads them to say he has committed blasphemy. So Jesus is condemned to death. He is beaten by the temple guards. He's spat upon. He's blindfolded and beaten. And then finally, he is put in a pit alone until he's taken out to go before the civil courts, which is Pilate. The Sanhedrin did not have the authority to actually put anyone to death, but they had their opinion mattered. They had to recommend it. So why? Why did this happen? And the easy answer is not just because it was predicted and it was prophesied. I'd like to say there are actually 3 reasons, and all 3 of them have to do with fear. Fear is a really, really powerful force. It leads us to do things that we would never think of in our right mind of doing. Fear is a powerful motivator among religious people, among non-religious people. We know definitely among politicians and everyone else in between. And the 3 fears that might have led the Sanhedrin are these. 1, they were fearful and insecure about Jesus, all of the teaching that Jesus was doing and preaching. The Pharisees were originally, remember a few weeks ago when I was preaching on who is this man, and I talked about how the Pharisees were originally invited Jesus to preach in their synagogues? But when Jesus's popularity started to increase, they started to become jealous. And jealousy becomes fearful. They became fearful. And they kept saying, like, why can't you preach like Jesus? It's kind of demoralizing. It's kind of like if you have a guest preacher and you say, why don't you take another day off, Pastor Linda? They started to disagree about what Jesus was actually saying. And he began to teach things that they disagreed with. In particular, some of his interpretations of Scripture. They thought they had God all figured out. It was crystal clear in their minds. And their teaching, they thought, was crystal clear. It was black and white. They understood who God was and what God was like, and Jesus challenged that. Jesus kept pointing back to him that God is like this. And that is not how they thought of. And then, remember the straw that broke the camel's back was when they started to accuse Jesus of healing in the name of Satan. That was the end. Then the second thing was, what about the people that agreed with Jesus? We know that there were people that agreed with Jesus. We know that there was at least 2 people, Pharisees, that agreed with Jesus. Nicodemus agreed with Jesus, and he was in the Sanhedrin. And there was Joseph of Arimathea. He agreed with Jesus. That's 2 people. Why didn't they say anything? Why didn't they say, we think Jesus is on the right track? I think we need to slow down here a little bit. We have no record of them ever saying anything. We have of anyone saying we better slow down. Why didn't they say something? Well, because they were afraid. They were afraid of what other people would say if they spoke up. And in that fear of that, they kept silent, even when they knew what was going to happen was totally wrong. I wonder if you can see yourself in the Sanhedrin. I know I can. Have you ever been afraid to be counted as a disciple of Jesus? On Friday, Jim and I saw the movie Race. It's about Jesse Owen, and it's about how Jesse Owen had qualified for the Olympic races. And of course it is in the 30s where Hitler is in charge of Germany, and black folk and Jews are not welcome. And so it's a story about that. And I wonder what I would have been preaching on a Sunday morning when that was happening. Would I have said anything to a congregation about that? And I betcha I wouldn't. So when I was preparing for this sermon, I thought of a woman by the name of Helen Suzman. Maybe you remember that name. She was a feisty woman. She was small in stature. She died just 6 years ago at the age of 91. She had fought apartheid in South Africa for over 4 decades. She reminded me of Wilbur Wilberforce, a member of the British Parliament who in the 1700s fought to stop the slave trade for decades. Not 10 years, not 20 years, but 30 years, and never gave up. And that's another good movie if you haven't seen it. The movie's called Amazing Grace. Well, Helen was the only woman who visited Robben Island to visit Nelson Mandela when he was in prison. She was the only person in Parliament in South Africa during the early 1970s who was willing to stand up and say, what we are doing to the Africans here is wrong. No one else would speak up and say it. And because she was a member of Parliament, she had immunity against a prosecution. Otherwise, she would have been prosecuted. It was against the law. She continued to speak out. She had death threats after death threats. But despite that fear, she stood up for what she knew was right. And she is still, to this day, a great hero in the townships of South Africa. She was 45 years old when she started to use her voice. She got her greatest strength when she was in her 60s, when she finally had felt the full authority to speak. So are you willing to say something? Are you willing to say that? Joseph and Nicodemus were quiet when they condemned Jesus to death. Fear. The last of these fears is the most tragic, and this fear continues to motivate us. I preached about this at Zion Lutheran this past Wednesday, so if you were there on Wednesday, you've already heard this. The high priest, as you know, is the highest religious authority in the land. He is in charge of the temple, the most holy shrine, and he's in charge of the temple courts. It was the high priest that determined that Jesus had to die. If the high priest hadn't said Jesus needed to die, Jesus wouldn't have been killed. So why did this high priest determine Jesus had to die? And the roots to this has to do with economic fear. It has to do with the high priest's paycheck. It started at the beginning of the week. When Jesus came into Jerusalem the next day, Monday, he went right to the temple. And when he went to the temple, he became very angry. He became very agitated. It's a picture of Jesus we don't usually like to imagine. He was so completely angry and agitated that he turned the tables over. Some picture him as a wild man. But why was Jesus so angry? What got him so angry? So let me remind you about what is going on during this week. We know that hundreds of thousands of people have arrived in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. We talked about that 2 Sundays ago. And when they came to Jerusalem, there are 2 things that they usually did. They went to the temple to pay the temple tax. You paid, and then the second was to have an offering. You paid your temple tax. That was half a shekel, which is 2 days' wages. The temple tax was designed to take care of the needs of the temple. And then you would offer an animal sacrifice or a grain sacrifice or an oil sacrifice to restore yourself into right relationship with God, or to ask for a cleansing after birth, like 8 days after you give birth, you go to the temple for a purification ceremony. Or after an illness, you might go to the temple. You offered offerings of fellowship with God. There were all kinds of offerings. Sometimes you brought an animal, sometimes you brought grain, sometimes you brought olive oil. Now, when you arrived in Jerusalem, you could bring your own animal. You could bring your own goat or sheep or calf. You could bring your own animal from your farm. When you went and brought the temple tax, the challenge was that there was a certain coinage you needed to use in paying the temple tax. It was called the temple shekel. No one used temple shekels. They used Roman coins, denarii. So when you came, you needed to change from shekels to denarii. You had to buy the correct coinage. So there were money changers there. Some of you who have traveled know about money changers, and they're set up in the temple courtyard so that they could see that you got the right coinage to make the right offering. Many of you had to exchange your money when you've traveled, so you know this. You've bought currency in another country and exchanged it back, and you may have been charged 1 or 2% for doing that. But the money changers in the temple, according to William Barclay, charged 20%. So if you made $10 an hour, 2 days' wages of $160, you're going to pay $32 to have your money changed. And if you have any change left over, it's going to be another $32 to change it back. So are you following this? Who are the people that are most hurt by this practice? The people who can least afford it, the poor. Then there was the selling of the animals. You could bring your own animal, but the high priest had inspectors who inspected your sacrifices, so they would look to see if your animal was perfect and was without blemish. If they found the animal wasn't perfect, then it would be disqualified from the sacrifice. So you would have to get rid of your animal, and then you have to get rid of it somehow. And then you would have to buy a new animal. And the temple just happened to have certified perfect animals for you to buy at 5 times the expense than the ones back home. But that was the price for getting a certified animal. So are you following this? Who are the people who are most struggling by having to pay 5 times as much to offer a sacrifice? It is the poor. So this is why, when we understand it, and oh, by the way, do you know who owns and manages all those concession stands or the leases on those market tables? The high priests and the chief priests. And they were administered by the high priest's father-in-law, Ananias, the former high priest. And so that is why in John's gospel, Jesus is taken to Ananias before he is taken to trial before the Sanhedrin. All of this is the reason why Jesus reacts the way he does. When people come to worship God, and they are poor, and they have nothing, and they come to worship God, and they bring what little they have, and it is disqualified, and they are ripped off by their own high priests, the response of Jesus is to stop it and to turn over the tables. And you can feel his anger. For the next 4 days, the market is closed. It's shut down at Passover, the busiest time of year. How many hundreds of thousands of denarii and shekels and dollars they lost when Jesus closed the market for 4 days. That fear of economic loss, can you feel how the high priest is feeling, what the high priest is feeling? Jesus has to die. The shops have to be able to be reopened. Jesus has to die. And then the Sanhedrin determined that Jesus had to die. But this reminds me of what Scripture says. Perfect love casts out fear. Jesus called his people not to live in fear, but to live in love. He called us not primarily to be concerned with orthodoxy, which is right belief, when we see and we all know in our time that we see things differently than we did 30 years ago. We see things differently than we were 10 years old, or 20 years old, or 30 years old. Things change. But Jesus talked about orthopraxis, or right practice, right action, that our beliefs have to have right action. We see movies like 42 about Jackie Robinson, and we see how things were wrong. Things that we would never think of doing now. Things change. So when we get God all figured out, and when you don't agree with me, you call me a heretic, or I vice versa. If I don't agree with you, I call you a heretic. When religious people have practiced their religion this way, they have practiced it at the very worst. But instead, when we say, listen, even if I do disagree with you, I can still love you, then they have found the teachings of Jesus. I have found myself afraid to say what I believe concerned about because I'm concerned about who might leave the church, or about my retirement, or about whatever, this or that. What will it cost me? I see myself in the Sanhedrin. But you know where I really see myself? Is out in the courtyard with Peter. He was the rock. Upon this rock, upon his faith, the church was supposed to be built. All four of the Gospels, as I mentioned, tell us this story. It's so important. And it's not to embarrass Peter. Peter was already dead when the Gospels were written. But all the believers knew that Peter was crucified upside down for his faith. I believe the story was repeated over and over again, was to give us hope. It was to give hope to everyone else. All the disciples had fled. Only Peter was there. He so wanted to do better, to keep his promise, to stay awake. He tried. He was scared. We see courage and we see cowardice in the same person. We see the struggle we all experience, seeking to follow Jesus and we want to keep our friends and our family. We seek to follow and we often fail. Peter's denial is a metaphor for the many ways we all fail to follow Christ. Peter was shown grace, and Peter went on to be a great leader. I believe the reason it is in all four Gospels is because Peter is an example of courage and cowardice. And all of us are going to fall short and deny Christ by our actions and our words. Peter, sitting out there, reminds us that if there was grace for Peter, there is grace for us. And that is the note I want to leave us with today. Amen. Lord, meet us in the silence. As we come to a prayer of thanksgiving, are there any prayers of joy and gratitude this morning. Go ahead, Melody.
Well, our granddaughter has been sick. She had RSV and then she got a touch of pneumonia. And since she's only 8 months old, we were very concerned. But she's doing much better now, and I think a lot of that has to do with prayer. And we are just so thankful for everybody who asked after her and that she's doing better.
So, generous God, are there any other prayers of thanksgiving this morning?
How'd you know, Benny? Yeah, last Sunday we were gone, like I announced. The week before we were in Tampa, Florida, visiting my brother Mike and his fiancee Kathy. And on last Saturday night, we went to Catholic Mass because Kathy is a Catholic. So that was interesting, worshiping there. And then Sunday morning, we worshiped at Ruskin United Methodist Church. And it's a congregation very similar to here. They greeted us with open arms. It was kind of fun for me because I got to sing in my brother Mike's quartet down there, which is the counterpart to the Not Half Bad quartet here. And we happened to do a couple of songs that we've done forever up here. My Anchor Holds, and then we did one from the Statler Brothers New Testament. So it was fun worshiping there. We got preached to, and it was fun worshiping down there, and the trip was a success. We look forward to going back down there in October when he gets hitched to this fine young lady.
So, generous God, any other prayers of thanksgiving and joy? About prayers of concern?
Some of you know that I have a friend that's in the Black Hawk County Jail. He comes up for pre-trial tomorrow, and he needs all kinds of prayers. Black Hawk County Jail, or the court, is not as bad as the Sanhedrin, but if you're poor, it's pretty well loaded against you. He has a public defender that he's never met with yet, and they're pressuring him to plead guilty to a felony because they don't want to put in the expense of taking him to trial. He insists he's guilty, he's not guilty, and I don't know, but it's just loaded against him. And so we need prayers to kind of tip the scale toward justice. Thank you.
Generous God, are there any other prayers of concern?
I just asked for prayers for the family of Annette Hurd. She is an air care paramedic, and she was involved in a drowning accident while on vacation in Hawaii. She was 4 months from becoming an air care nurse. And so her immediate family, her 2 adult children and grandchildren and husband, as well as our EMS family, could really use all of our prayers of support as they face her funeral this Friday. Thank you.
Generous God, pour out your love.
We would like to ask for prayers for our daughter-in-law, Kia Hopkins, in Colorado. She has been experiencing dizziness, vertigo, lightheadedness, coming and going. It happens, and then she's okay. It goes away, and then it comes back again, and they're quite concerned what may be going on inside of her head. So we would really appreciate prayers for Kia. Thank you.
Generous God, pour out your love. I like, this really is prayers of concern, but just a prayer of petition. It's for all those that are coming up for ordination, those for the probationary stage of being a preparatory elder or deacon, and those that are seeking full elder's orders over the next couple of days. So, generous God. And also, I like prayers for the team from Trinity United Methodist in Waverly, and also Hampton United Methodist Church, that are traveling to the depot, the Umpqua Depot. Some of you several years ago went on the Umpqua Depot. I know the Sanfords did, and the Pipperts and Marcia Taylor, and that's where the Waverly crew is headed for next week or so. So generous God, pour out your love. And let us join in the prayers